also to all those who are following us on screen. This debate is live streamed on YouTube, on Facebook, and also on our webpage of the Press Club, www.pressclub.ch. And if you want later on have a second look of this debate, it will stay on our website. So it's a very crucial and a very timely moment to discuss human rights today, especially with Ukraine news going on, with the war going on. We're talking a lot about war crimes. The first trial just happened this week from a Russian soldier in Ukraine for war crimes. So we adapted a little bit this discussion to also be able to discuss the efficiency and what can do the Human Rights Council in this specific case of Ukraine. We'll start with this, but the core discussion will go around the Human Rights Council. How does it act? How is it evolving? Is it an efficient body? Much better than the previous one? Yes, no? And what are the different point of views of the speakers here who represent NGOs and other academic organizations? I'm going to present you for sure in a few seconds. So, as said, first part we'll discuss the way the investigation is going on in Ukraine and what type of crimes we are talking about. Secondly, we're going to really go thoroughly into the Human Rights Council to see how this really works. What's the credibility today of this Human Rights Council? And finally, we try to go back shortly to Ukraine situation, to see if there is any chance these trials that have started now come really to an international level, will really have results, and in about what kind of timeline. For some, I know not all of you are experts on every question, but I'm very interested to have your opinions. So first I present Ambassador Federico Villegas. Thank you very much for being with us. You are, since the start, 1st of January or 31 of December 21, you are the president of the Human Rights Council. You're also the ambassador here to the UN of Argentina. And you're here actually for a pretty long time in Geneva. How many? 2 years. 2 years, okay. Which is a pretty long time in Geneva. Welcome. Beside of you, Mrs. Lucy McKernan, welcome. Lucy McKernan, you are the United Nations Deputy Director Advocacy at Human Rights Watch. Thank you. And beside of me, Mr. Kevin Whelan, you are the Amnesty International representative to the United Nations here in Geneva, for sure. And Mr. Felix Kirchmeier, who is the Executive Director at the Geneva Human Rights Platform, which is a project, one can say, from the Geneva Academy for Human Rights. So many human rights in this room. Welcome to all of you. So let's perhaps start with this first topic. So turn myself towards Mr. Ambassador Villegas. When we talk about war crimes, kind of generic word, what are we talking about really? What kind of different war crimes are they?
It's on?
Yeah, it's on.
Thank you for the invitation. The issue of war crimes has evolved, like many other issues in international law. That is why now we refer to mass atrocities, which is something that we have been talking about recently. Why? Because mass atrocities include war crimes, but go beyond war crimes. So in general, you have crimes against humanity, you have genocide, specific crimes against humanity, and then you have war crimes. And of course, in war crimes, we used to have the rules during the war, when the war was allowed, before we decided that the war was forbidden. So in Geneva, the heart of international humanitarian law, we developed precisely the rules of the war that to make it the more human possible or the less inhuman possible. And that is why certain actions during a military conflict, like bombing a hospital, come to the case of a war crime, or not allowing a humanitarian corridor, which is something that we are always watching in this. So we are watching live in this conflict many categories of different mass atrocities that are occurring live, which has not been the case in many conflicts.
Thank you, Mrs. Lucy McKernan. At the beginning, everybody was very cautious about these crimes, what exactly they were. Today, it seems more and more plausible that we talk really about war crimes. What's your assessment of the crimes from what you know and what you estimate? How do you see the gravity of these crimes in Ukraine?
Thank you very much. So, yeah, Human Rights Watch have been very concerned about the situation in Ukraine and been on the ground there since day one. So we've been monitoring and reporting on what we're seeing there. And so far we can report that we've documented apparent cases of war crimes and potential crimes against humanity, including cases of summary executions, torture, enforced disappearances, and the indiscriminate use of weapons. We're also been very concerned about the use of cluster munitions, which we've seen in Ukraine, which of course are prohibited and have a very, very severe impact on civilian populations.
Thank you. Mr. Kevin Whelan from Amnesty International. What is the role of Amnesty International in this phase of investigation? You have also sent some members of Amnesty there, I guess. How do you work? I mean, how is it concretely going on? And how do you look for this evidence?
Yes, well, thank you for the invitation and good afternoon, everyone. I mean, I think just to start with your question about the gravity of the situation. Yeah. I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine has created a catastrophe with major human rights dimensions. It's having an impact throughout Ukraine in many of the ways that Lucy has mentioned, but well beyond Ukraine in terms of global food shortages, includes in terms of higher energy prices, at a time when we have a system that's deeply under strain. In terms of the role of Amnesty International is a movement of 10 million people with different elements. We have an international secretariat with a research component. We also have Amnesty Ukraine, a section which has been in Ukraine for almost 20 years. So when we're talking about Amnesty dealing with the crisis, we're talking about friends and colleagues and their families in Ukraine who've been engaging with the authorities on human rights issues in Ukraine for nearly 20 years, facing challenges. We're also talking about having crisis colleagues with expertise in documenting war crimes, analyzing evidence of military shelling and the like being deployed to Ukraine to conduct research. And we've had recently, a few weeks ago, we had an international delegation that traveled to Ukraine that released reporting on our research to date, and our research will be ongoing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Finally, Mr. Felix Kirschmeier, what is your assessment of the situation, and how do you compare Ukraine, as you are an expert of human rights, you all are, but you are an academic, studying this. How do you compare the situation in Ukraine with previous conflicts? Can you make a comparison?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Rushdie, for the invitation here to the Club Suisse de la Presse. So indeed, there a big difference between the work we do at the Geneva Academy, at the Geneva Human Rights Platform, to the NGO friends also on the table, is that we're not on the ground. So indeed, what we do is providing resources on the legal classification of conflicts. And there I think also is a big important fact also when you say, what do we know, what is going on? So in fact, we heard about the NGO activities also in verifying the facts, in fact-finding missions. But I think if we look then also at the OSCE report, where one of our previous director, Professor Sassoli, was involved also, we see the value of those institutional missions also establishing facts and going to the ground. And I think there too also seeing the differences, obviously, and that's where we'll probably come to in a next part of the discussion, as you said, of the Human Rights Council and also humanitarian law violations. So violations of humanitarian law, we have there also, I think, quite a body of, as you say, rules that govern armed conflict, and also established guidelines of how to investigate violations of those. And then on the other hand, the Human Rights Council's role with the Commission of Inquiry that we'll surely be speaking about. Now comparing to other conflicts, you take me a little bit off guard, because of course there you have so many levels that you could look into, which I would say are often also maybe political levels. So I think also there is many conflicts ongoing around the world. We have a big spotlight on Ukraine. It's closer to Europe. Let's be frank about that. So that's also why part of that attention is going more there. But then also something that we, many of us could surely not have imagined, such an aggression just coming about next door. So even if signs surely have been there for a long while of the preparation of troops and so on. So the fact that really this invasion would take place the way it did was probably also so much of an astonishment than to many commentators over here. In terms of the violations, I think it's maybe not that different. So we have had other recent conflicts, and there was also, I think, comparisons drawn, including with the involvement of Russia. And I think the violations of humanitarian law or human rights are not necessarily differing that much actually from other conflicts. But again, this is not seeing the situation on the ground, so I think there I'd have to defer also to the colleagues who have their colleagues actually in the field.
So for the situation on the ground, Ambassador Villegas, the Human Rights Council have sent some experts, independent experts. Perhaps first question, what does mean independent experts? Everybody wants to be independent. How do you certify the independence of the expertise?
The Human Rights Council decided only 8 days after the invasion of Russia to Ukraine, while the Security Council was blocked by the veto of the same country that caused the conflict. Across the Atlantic, 4 days after that, here we were able to approve a historic resolution, the first time in history that a commission of inquiry for alleged violations of human rights and humanitarian law is created on a permanent member of the Security Council. And we did it here, among other things, because we don't have a veto in the Human Rights Council. And as you know, Russia and Ukraine both were members of the Council. But that resolution, with Russia being a member, was approved by 32, with only 13 abstentions and 2 votes against. That commission of inquiry, like all mechanisms of the Council, we have around 14 commissions of this type on different countries and independent experts. Are independent because they are not tied to a specific country. They are independent because they are created through a multilateral system of a UN body. They are independent also because in appointing them, and that was probably one of the hardest jobs I had since I started, we guarantee the independence if those persons, not only they are highly qualified, which is the case, but also they have not outspoken openly on prejudging what is going on in the field. And I can tell you that in a conflict which is so violent and that the whole world is talking and reading in the first page, it was very hard to combine the two things.
How many experts?
3 people, a former judge of the European Court of Human Rights and a judge of Norway, and a woman from Bosnia and Herzegovina, ombudswoman, and former vice chair of the work on enforced disappearance of persons, and Pablo de Grave, Colombian, professor at New York University, the first rapporteur on memory, justice, and reparation of the UN Human Rights Council, an expert in Burundi. And I think that those people, among other things, not only they are qualified, if after over a month that were appointed that they are working already fully, we hadn't had not a single complaint about lack of objectivity, not a single complaint on being biased or having outspoken on one side or the other. And that it's a strong case for their independence. That's why they're working very well.
Thank you very much. Yes, reminder that you should speak as close as possible to the mic, so for the broadcast. Thank you. So just following up on this, the fact that you have sent your experts, but NGOs have sent their experts, Ukraine for sure is investigating too. There are a lot of people, as the war is still going on, a lot of people who are already doing this work of collecting evidence. Who is kind of federating or organizing all this, and is there not a risk that this becomes kind of ununderstandable or a lot of contradictions, or is it positive in another way?
All the mechanisms are complementary because they all want something which is justice, accountability, because that's the real reparation for the victims of these atrocities. So it is true, we need coordination, and in the creation of the commission, if you look at the resolution, paragraph 9, it's clear that they will work with other instances because their job is not only to collect evidence, is to identify if possible responsible to eventually be prosecuted. Therefore, they will have to work with the different instances that are on the ground, and some type of coordinations I'm sure they will develop among the different instances.
But there is not a leader who they have to report to. I mean, it's kind of a
the Commission of
situation.
Inquiry reports to the Council of Human Rights that created the Commission. And they already presented here on the 12th of May, we had a special session, an additional special session with an additional resolution for the deteriorating situation in Ukraine that was also approved by a wide majority. On the situation of Mariupol, and the commission was here in Geneva working, and so they were presented and they spoke before the council. But they will report to us, but they will work also in coordination with the monitoring situation, monitoring mission of the High Commissioner that was created by the council since 2014, is working in the ground, and is the one that you can see in the internet every day updating the civilian casualties, who is killed, who is injured in different areas, children, women. That is on the ground from the Human Rights Council since 2014 working, and that is the natural complement to the Commission of Inquiry that will work with them. And those two mechanisms of the Council of Human Rights in Ukraine, of course, will coordinate their work also with the different instances that we have. We have national prosecutors of different European countries. We have the Ukrainian, of course, prosecution. And we have the ICC, as we know, Mr. Khan. So the important thing is not to double victimize the people. If we have to look why we need to coordinate, I would say the most important thing is that it's very unfair for a victim of an atrocity to get 5 different people to ask her the same story. That, you know, that woman that we also coming out of the maternity on a table, pregnant, it will be very unfair that in order to bring justice to that, we ask that woman 5 times, 5 different people, what happened. So some type of coordination is needed.
Question to all of you, but perhaps start with you, Mr. Villegas, again. The fact that trials are going on already and that the war is still on, is it a special problem and is it unusual in this process? I mean, it seems to go very quickly, no?
Yes, I don't know. We'll have to see what's the impact of trials already in the ground and these different mechanisms. I have no answer yet, but it's another type of intention of accountability that I think is very legitimate in any conflict, not only in this one.
Lucy McCarron, what's your point on this? Is it going fast, too fast, or it never goes fast enough?
So we're really pleased to see the amount of political will for seeking accountability for the crimes that we're seeing in Ukraine. And I agree with you that it's quite a crowded space. There's a lot of justice actors who have already intervened and been activated, and we think that's a really positive thing. There's no doubt that because of the scale of the abuses that we've seen, that we're going to need a lot of different actors playing different roles. The ICC, traditionally will take on a couple of cases. They won't take on the hundreds or thousands that are needed. So certainly we're also pleased to see some states already initiating investigations on the basis of universal jurisdiction, and we welcome that. And of course then there's the national Ukrainian prosecutor's role, which is really crucial, and where we see the majority of cases being undertaken. You mentioned there's a trial has already started this week. Again, we see this as really positive, that the Ukrainians are moving fast.
But can this be a fair trial? I mean, we are still in war. It's Ukrainian judging a Russian soldier in this very strong emotionally and in the wartime. Can you really make a fair trial in this condition?
Well, I think we need to have faith in the Ukrainian justice system, and there's no doubt that it will need support from international partners to assist it to carry out that important role and to ensure, as you say, that the trials are fair and that they comply with international standards for fair trials.
Mr. Kirchmeier, on this perhaps?
Yes, maybe just again to underline 2 facts here. I think very much that question of international standards in national proceedings. I think also, and I just pulled up a statement 4 days ago from the UN expert on extrajudicial executions, so another special procedure expert of the Human Rights Council created by the Human Rights Council, who also points out exactly what you say, the danger of overcrowding the space and basically turning that, as Lucy just said, into a positive aspect. And so underlining really the importance of the support to the national investigations, and you just mentioned it, the number of cases. I think the Ukrainian prosecutor has taken up 42 cases, and there is 11,000 violations that shall be examined. So the sheer volume also here. But so there are international standards. There are international standards like on, as I said, the investigation of violations of IHL, also on torture allegations. So I think it will be crucial that the national system follows those, and actually that the international community maybe also, instead of creating even more international possibilities, also supports those national efforts. And I think, yes, indeed, the Commission, also the ICC prosecutor with people on the ground, it's a lot here. And what the ambassador said, I think avoiding the re-traumatization will be also very important, which in fact in the absence of such an overall instance that would coordinate is definitely a given danger. But I think it's also good that we see exactly by that statement coming from a procedure of the Human Rights Council that there is a lot of awareness of this problem, and also a willingness to support the national mechanisms in that enhancing that coherence.
But should I ask you the question, Mr. Wehan? Should there be a body, special body created to supervise, or I don't know how to manage all this? Can you imagine that, or do you want to leave it how it works now? And you are, as Amnesty, you are very involved, and you have a lot of members. You are on the ground there, in the field.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I would start with the fact that this isn't the only conflict where there have been multiple actors working to document evidence, and I think that there can be some lessons learned and drawn from cases, for example, like Syria, where actors in this space can share their lessons learned with the Commission of Inquiry and others working on justice for Ukraine. I would note that the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry includes cooperation with judicial and other entities, so it's specifically there. I do think it might be a little challenging to have one, given the separate mandates, and to have one entity directing everything. But as you have identified, I think coordination is essential, and it needs to be front and center. The ambassador talked about re-traumatization of witnesses. That's absolutely true. It's also about the strength of the evidence, because if you have one person giving 5 statements, not only are they re-traumatized, but it is fertile ground for cross-examination. And so, for many reasons, I think it's important to ensure that each mechanism that's involved in this space is doing so with some sense of their responsibilities to coordinate. Maybe I just want to kind of go back to a starting point about the kind of scale and scope of the violations and the need. What we are seeing vastly exceeds any capability of domestic authorities at this moment, just by virtue of the nature and scale of the violations. And I think so there are potentially 2 options. One is to find ways that are not exclusive. One is to find ways to support domestic authorities in the work that they have. Another is to create or deploy additional resources to the field. And I think both of those need to be brought to bear. Maybe one other thing I would say is that, in terms of documenting evidence of crimes, time is of the essence, and it's important to deploy as many resources as possible. But there are going to be some real challenges in terms of documentation of evidence. For example, balance against the needs, for example, to reconstruct. Okay, you have a building that's been destroyed. There might be shards of weapons. Do you leave that in place to ensure you have preserved evidence, or there are people who need houses? There are people who are homeless. So these are very difficult challenges, I think, that the authorities will have to face as they're moving forward. So it's not always just about deploying more resources and ensuring effective coordination. And I would say also that we're talking about different types of violations. We're talking about some violations where you can just look at the shards of a shell and you can identify its manufacturer and the like. But there are other types of violations, sexual violence, for example, where oftentimes it's very difficult, given the stigma, given challenges, that we might not have a full scope of documented evidence at this moment. We might only, through time, be able to have a fuller sense of what we can demonstrate.
And this is a very interesting point, because in this area of fake news and wrong information circulating, and Russians on their side use it a lot, won't it be much more challenging than in every other conflict to have testimonies that really fit, and that really they will all be denied. There will always be contradiction to this. On the Russian side, they already said that all this is not true. I mean, aren't we, because of the way today information is circulating, a very special challenge for the investigation today? I don't know, perhaps Mr. Villegas or who wants to answer this? Or
I mean, I can pick up initially. I think just on that, I think, you know, we're talking about accountability. For the time being, we focused a lot on criminal accountability and evidence, but there are other forms of accountability. You know, our starting point is, you know, the victims and survivors of this conflict, whose needs are massive, whose lives are changed irreparably by the conflict, and at the same time, you're having people come out and say that they're actors. This is deplorable, and you know, this is one of the roles that the Human Rights Council's independent commission of inquiry can play, is to be an independent source of verifiable evidence to speak truth against that. And I think that's the same in any judicial proceeding. You need evidence, you need to present. And I think all of these different elements of accountability are essential, amongst other tools, to countering disinformation.
other comments on this, perhaps?
So I'll jump in as well. I mean, on the point of disinformation, I'm not sure it's hugely different from other conflicts. We've seen this before. It's not necessarily new to this conflict. So I'd say at first, but then I would also, building on what Kevin has said, emphasise that, you know, that's how I see the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry appointed by the Human Rights Council as really essential, but different also from the other, what I would call justice actors. The Commission of Inquiry has a public reporting element in that it's required to report back to the Human Rights Council about what it's seeing. And this is something that we don't expect, you know, the ICC or other players to be doing on a regular basis. So it's a really important element of its mandate, which will help to correct the record, if you like, in terms of the disinformation that's out there. The other thing that the Commission of Inquiry can do, and the experts themselves have said that they want to do, is take a very victim-centred approach. So really listen to the voices of victims and those who've suffered violations and family members and so on, and bring their voices out, which is something, again, that the sort of criminal adjudicating bodies won't be doing necessarily. I think another element is identifying trends and patterns in the conflict. So to sort of map the violations, if you like, and provide that sort of overall overview picture. So I think what that emphasises for me is that the COI has a different role to the other players, but a really crucial one.
Thank you. Let's perhaps talk a little bit more than now about Human Rights Council. How does it work? And just for the transition, Ambassador Villegas, you are president now at a very special moment, actually. I mean, a war in Europe. There are a lot of expectations from the Human Rights Council, for the people towards the Human Rights Council. Will this be definitely very important test for the organization, or do you consider this a little bit as business as usual? Do you have really to prove now that you can do your job in this? And wouldn't it be the fact that you as a body, the direction of the operations there, wouldn't that be an initiative that shows your capacity of reaction? Well, many questions, I'm sorry.
Yeah, many questions. I mean, let's start from the beginning. 2 weeks ago, the Human Rights Council became the intergovernmental body of the whole UN system with the highest presence in social media. That is simply the fact that common people identify to what we do. Because in one way or another, what we do touch human beings. All of us are impacted by the Human Rights Council, whether because we are addressing a serious situation in a country, but also whether we are having the progressive development of human rights norms and standards. The norms that protect us and future generations are created in the Human Rights Council here in Geneva. We are the hub of the progressive development. So what it means is that we are now in a crucial moment. I don't think it's going to be business as usual for many reasons. First, in 1 month, we saw 2 world orders that were imploded. The Second World War order on the not using force to solve the conflict and violating the Charter, and then the post-Cold War order. Because after the post-Cold War, we looked all for a world that will have human rights and rule of law as the new world order that we all read and talked about. And that didn't happen. On the contrary, we are seeing imploding that. We are having Russia out of the Council of Europe. That means after September 16, they will not be able to make a complaint before the European Court of Human Rights. And you know, the only place where Russian people will be able to bring their claims if something happens and they are not satisfied with their authorities in the fulfillment of human rights is this, Geneva. The Human Rights Council is the place where they will have. So we are in a special moment. And of course, in the bigger picture, let's be honest, the Human Rights Council, even though we are one of the 3 pillars of the UN, even though we are everything that we are talking about, we are just one of the 153 subsidiary organs of the General Assembly. So it is kind of awkward that such an important body dealing with that leverage in the international community, you know, the urgent debate we decided to do immediately on Ukraine. When I gave the word to one representative, that session was followed by 9 million people or 8 million people online. So what I mean is we are in a crucial moment, a definite moment, to see if we want to continue strengthening this system that was created. It is a best system and a historic system, better system than before. We have to remember that the Commission of Human Rights for 50 years created many good standards, because actually the 11 treaties of human rights that we have were part of that good story, but a very bad story on another side. Human rights were hijacked by the Cold War. For 50 years, we had only some country situations addressed by the former Commission of Human Rights. The ones that in the geopolitics of the time were part of the menu of the East and the West. 180 countries of the world were never had to put their human rights situation on the ground, on the table, to get criticism or get NGOs, prestigious ones, people like today, talking about the other story of what the state says. That never happened. This council created an outstanding mechanism, Universal Periodic Review. We are about to start the 4th cycle, which means that 193 member states have to put periodically their human rights situation on the table and get recommendations, criticisms by NGOs, by other states. They commit publicly to change policies, and then they have to be accountable for that. So yes, it is a turning point, I think, for the leverage of the Human Rights Council.
NGOs, UN, Human Rights Watch, as well as Amnesty International, have been very critical also towards the Human Rights Council in the recent years even. Do you agree? Do you think that NGOs are really listened to today? And are you confident the Human Rights Council can do the job in this case? I don't know, Lucy McKernan, perhaps?
I'll go first. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so look, there's no doubt that there are challenges within the Human Rights Council, and often NGOs are pushing for the council to do more. But I largely agree with what Ambassador Villegas has said. I mean, it's an intergovernmental body, so clearly it will be influenced by politics, and states will try to press their own national interests within the council. But within that context, if you look at what the Council has been able to achieve, I think it's significant. And just to give example, last year we saw 5 special sessions of the UN Human Rights Council addressing human rights crises very contemporaneously in Myanmar, in relation to Sudan, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, and Israel and Palestine, and were able to adopt resolutions and take effective action in relation to all of those instances. And I think that's very significant action from a state body. I think also the Human Rights Council is a good place for discussion of difficult issues. The Council adopts resolutions regularly on topics that are hard for states to discuss, like racial discrimination or sexual orientation and gender identity. These are topics that are difficult, but they're under discussion, and there are advances that you can see from the Human Rights Council. So I did want to emphasise that. I also want to point out that one of the things, I think, more positive elements that we can see that have come out recently is the suspension of Russia from the Human Rights Council. And this is important because it shows that the Human Rights Council has standards that apply to members that are elected to the Council, and we now know that those standards can be applied in appropriate situations. And I think Russia was a very clear case in the face of violations that we've seen in Ukraine, but also the human rights situation domestically, and we can refer also to the situation in Syria. So there was plenty of evidence, I think, in this case, but the important thing that vote suspending Russia's membership shows is that the membership standards will be applied to members of the Human Rights Council, and I think that gives the body a lot of credibility.
Thank you. So,
sure. Maybe just to pick up on a couple of points. And yes, I mean, the Human Rights Council is an intergovernmental body. It's a political institution. But you compare it against some of the other intergovernmental bodies and political institutions in the UN, and you see the Council doing significant work, let's say, in contrast to the logjams we might see at the Security Council on crucial issues. One thing that I would just emphasize is it's not just the Human Rights Council engaging with different topics, but I also think you see some refinement, development. You see some creativity. I think over the past number of years, the Council has moved towards away from what we would say classic commissions of inquiry with just monitoring and reporting mechanisms to evidence preservation models, where there is a bridge towards further accountability, and that's an innovation. That's something that we support, and we hope to see the Council expand. Maybe just a few other reflections in terms of business as usual. I think I think every day, every session is a test for the Council. There are crises across the world, from China to Iran to Saudi Arabia, where victims are looking to the Council for some attention, for some help. As the ambassador had said, at this moment, we're with Russia's withdrawal from the Council of Europe, one of the only places internationally for Russian civil society to come is the Human Rights Council. And just that is one of the reasons why Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, amongst other organizations, are supporting Russian civil society's call for the establishment of a special rapporteur on Russia at the Human Rights Council in the upcoming session.
Thank you. Mr. Kirschmeier, one question. The problem in the Commission of Human Rights before was that some states were clearly violating on a high scale human rights, and so they had the word like all the others. Still today, I mean, there are some countries, or even a few countries, that are far from perfect in question of human rights. Russia perhaps was one of them. It was decided now to exclude it. So first, was it a good move to exclude Russia? Is it useful for the discussion and for the going forward with reinforcing human rights? And let's start with this question, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you very much. And and indeed, the exclusion of Russia from the Council came also at another historic moment, which is actually when it was the first time that all the permanent 5 members of the Security Council were also members in the Human Rights Council. So already there we had debates of the value of the Council, actually seeing that all those 5 permanent members actually want a seat in the Council too. And I think the exclusion now of Russia from membership, and we have to distinguish here between membership and observership. So I would agree very much that it is a good thing that Russia was excluded from membership in the Human Rights Council. Now, it would surely not be good to exclude Russia from discussions in the Human Rights Council or in the wider UN system. I think it is necessary to have a space where you can discuss with whatever differences you have. That's also why the UN partly why the UN was established, and I think therefore it's very important to see that a country is still there, is still discussing, and I think it's also interesting to look a little bit deeper into the Council and all its very inventive mechanisms. So you said it's one of 153 sub-organs, but it's maybe the most inventive because we just heard about all the commissions of inquiry, but then also all the other mechanisms that the Council established actually take a, say, institutional life of their own. And I think there too we see that, for example, when we talk about one of the crimes that's high on the radar, enforced disappearances, actually, the working group on enforced and involuntary disappearances just met until I think last week or the week before, and they received allegations regarding Russia, and it's my understanding that while Russia is not a member of the Council anymore, it has not broken all the ties with the whole system, so it does reply still to also discussions in the system, and that goes also, of course, I think you mentioned the Universal Periodic Review, or also then the treaty bodies, another part of the Geneva-based international human rights system, where we do see that engagement, and I think this is very important actually to maintain.
Perhaps Mr. Villegas on this?
Yes. Definitely, it's a game changer to have a member that is in the middle of a term out of the Council. But as you say, it's important that we realize that the system applies to members and non-members and observers, because we have 47 countries representing 193 countries and elected by 193. So every single UN member is the client of the Council, to say in a way. So the human beings of those 193, whether they are observers or members, can use the mechanisms exactly as you mentioned, working groups, commissions, special rapporteurs, or even send a letter to the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, or to the President sometimes. So it's important that the engagement of Russia with the system continues. It's not the first case. We have around 13 observer states of the Council that have commissions of inquiry, that have special rapporteurs, that they sit there and they listen to the reports and they listen to the NGOs and the states. And if I may, I would like to, on the question you made before, let's be clear, we wouldn't have a Human Rights Council if it weren't for the NGOs. It's as simple as that. You know, we came this long way because of the work of human rights defenders that listened to victims many decades ago and started a process that is now what we have. And coming from Argentina and on enforced disappearance, the mothers and grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo came to this Geneva in the 70s, trying for the international community to realize there was something going on that was not assassination, was not torture, was something else, massive use of enforced disappearance as a method. And asking this commission in the middle of the Cold War to acknowledge that. Those people in the 30s, those women, came back to Geneva to approve the International Convention on Enforced Disappearance as part of the Argentine delegation. When they were here 30 years before, they were kicked out of the room because they were considered terrorists by the delegation sitting there. So that evolution is the bigger picture of what we are talking about. So we need to continue all member states to be engaged. And I hope sincerely that the Russian Federation at least continues with the temperament and the tone and the participation that all other countries that have also commissions of inquiry, special rapporteurs, go to the council, sit there, listen to the reports. Sometimes they don't like what the NGOs say or other states say, but they are part of the system and engagement. So we will see, because we will know in the next session how does the Russian Federation decide to participate.
You are all very positive about the work, how it's done today in the Human Rights Council. NGOs, what would you like to change? I mean, you have a critical role, a role of critic in this body also. So what could be or should be improved? What changes do you expect? Do you support?
Sure, I can start, but I just want to pick up on this issue of membership. I mean, it is important for there to be membership standards. It's important for members to hold each other to accountable. It's membership should be a spotlight. It should not be a shield. At the same time, I want to make very clear, and this is picking up what others said, whether a state is a member of the council or not, it does not at all change their legal obligations, their international legal obligations. So that's, I think, important.
Yeah, let's perhaps stick to this question. We go back to the other one because it's interesting. Let's stick to the question of membership, if you don't mind. In the Commission, the fact that the country was in the Commission was a kind of proof that he could be safe in the Commission. Today, there are still, as I said, different countries that don't respect, that violate on a current basis human rights, who are in the Commission, in the Council. Isn't it also a way for them to escape judgment of the Council and kind of recognition of their good behavior? Political tool, yes. Mr. Villegas.
Okay. Well, that discussion we had in 2005.
Yes.
That was basically it. There was this idea, the Commission was failing because of the politicization, selectivity, etc. And so we started deciding, what do we do? So there were two things we proposed. One, the hierarchy within the system, and we did that. It was a subsidiary organ of ECOSOC, not even from the General Assembly. So we put it to subsidiary of the GA. We didn't get to the permanent body that we would have liked. We were not ready for at that time, but we did that. The other is the membership. So there was a discussion that actually lasted, and I was participating there because I was Director of Human Rights at that time. And it was interesting. The discussion of having a council of the few countries that were up to the moral standard to become part lasted 3 months, basically. Because when we started discussing how do we select those countries, and they even talked about a council of 15, like the Security Council. That was the first proposal. Imagine a Human Rights Council of 15 countries that supposedly are so untouchable in their human rights record that they can be there, assessing what's happening all over the world. Of course, it was impossible to decide that because there's not a single country on earth that can say that has a complete human rights record. And that is a fact. The special rapporteurs, independent experts, not only talk about a few countries of the South, of the global South, they talk about many other things that happen in developed countries. We had a special session on George Floyd, and we approved a new mechanism for assessing police violence in racial, with racial emphasis. Approved, and we appointed 3 experts to assess all over the world, and it was because of the George Floyd case. And we assess anti-Semitism, and we assess migrants in Europe. And it's much better to have everybody on board to be able to impact the countries that have structural problems than to isolate and say, if they don't listen to us, we will solve their problems. Actually, there's not a single case of reversing human rights situation without being able to at least have an engagement with the victims of those countries.
So Kirschmeier?
Yes, maybe just to underline the fact that, of course, no state is perfect, so that's the one point, but then also your point of shielding. So I think, of course, powerful states might often find ways to shield themselves from criticism, but we see that it was not the case here with Russia. And additionally, I think it's not so much anymore a question of being part of the Human Rights Council, or as it was before, the Commission or not. It's more of other power politics. I think quite the contrary, if you think about the mechanism of the Universal Periodic Review that was mentioned by Ambassador before. Actually, at the very start, there was also discussion, how do we start the cycle? Do we go alphabetically through the 193, or what do we do? And so actually, alphabetically, partially yes, but actually what they did, they started with the very members of the council. So saying, we will review the human rights situation everywhere, in all states, so that's already the big difference, but then additionally to that, not shielding the members to say we start with all the others first and later we come to the members, but no, expressly start with those. So I think that shielding was not the same anymore as in the Commission.
But how do you then understand the critics that are still on from China, for example, supported by developing countries, that the Human Rights Council is a tool, an instrument of the Western nations and the Western values? Is this just politics, or how do you feel that?
I don't think, definitely, I don't think that the Human Rights Council is a tool of the West or something like that. The Human Rights Council is what we want the Human Rights Council to be, and each member decides how to stand before the Council and strengthen or use the mechanisms. And I give you an example on Ukraine. If the Russian Federation, member of the Council, was so worried about Russian minorities in Ukraine, they had all the mechanisms of the Council at their disposal to use their political leverage to address the issue before the Council. We could have had a special session on Russian minorities in Ukraine. You could have asked all the special rapporteurs that do reports like the one he just mentioned to do a special report. You could have presented. So each country decides what to do with the Council. But we have political debates that are not resolved. And let's be honest, in the post-Cold War era, we had this idea that civil political rights were actually the great outcome of the Cold War. But then, with everything that happened, inequality, obscene inequality in the world, the planet completely damaged, we realized that no, all rights are important. And so that discussion of how to address human is still a tension of philosophy, which is not the East and the West and communism and capitalism. It's another game, but has something like that we haven't addressed yet. It is true, there is a group of countries that they say that some countries overemphasize certain issues and diminish or doesn't realize the importance of other issues. That's why when you go to the pattern, 35 resolutions we approved, 19 by consensus. By the way, one on disinformation, that I invite this audience to look at it, by consensus, very rare. I didn't think it would be approved by consensus, but it was. And then we had 16 by a vote. If you look at the pattern of those that were voted, you see exactly the answer to your question. Because there you see the myriad of philosophical issues that certain countries do not agree, on one side or on the other. So we need to bring a constructive dialogue of mutual understanding to see if we can have more and more by consensus and less by voting. It's not easy.
Thank you very much. So to wrap it up, and then we will ask for questions in the room. Can you tell us, each one of you, just the one thing, shortly, the one thing you think, to come back to the question, you think that needs to be changed to have a more efficient, or even more efficient, Human Rights Council? Mr. Verne.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I don't want anybody to be left with the impression that we view everything as fine in the UN system or in the Human Rights Council. And I think there are many things that could be improved. I think that there is a challenge of ensuring all states are equally applying the principles they set publicly. And then the other thing that I would identify is an issue of resources and bandwidth, because I think that you have, coming back to civil society, you have civil society from various parts of the world coming to the Human Rights Council because they see the value. States see the value. It's an incredibly contested space. And there is a concern, I think, with budgetary issues that we have capping of debates. We have a fear that, oh no, the council is going to be going on for too many weeks. If we open up video statements to civil society, then this could go on forever. So I guess my question is that a bad thing if it's a demonstration of the fact that civil society from across the world value this enough to risk themselves by putting themselves out there at the Human Rights Council? So I guess my suggestion is, as we're dealing with this issue of capacity, not just think about how the council can be more efficient, but also how it can expand its resources to, as the ambassador said, be of the same level and caliber of its importance in the system.
Yes, thank you. Well, definitely, I think we have to evolve and become a permanent body of the UN, not just a body that meets once in a while when a budget is approved, because the human rights challenges are 24/7, 365 days, and involves 7 billion people of every single country. So to have this idea that between sessions nothing happens and nothing requires the attention of the council, it's actually not a fact. And that's why we have special sessions. And we have to, look for ways to continue being involved in it. So at least the discussion of one of the 3 pillars of the UN, which is mainstreaming development and peace and security, it is the proof, this conflict, that the best prevention of any conflict is to have a strong human rights institutions. The best way to reconstruct a society and a tissue of a society after conflict is through human rights institutions. The best sustainable development is through human rights included. And Europe is the best example of a continent that witnessed the worst wars and atrocities of enemies of centuries that were able to heal the social tissue of this part of Europe and develop this, what you have now, which is unthinkable to see and think that those atrocities will be repeated in that. Why? It was human rights. It was not European integration and steel and coal. It was the human rights institutions that were set here, the prevention. So I think the Human Rights Council could be, at least we should start discussing the possibility, of course without amending the charter, anything but amending the charter, because amending the charter is a process which is too difficult, too long, too complicated. Article 108 requires the permanent members of the Security Council to be in favor, so it will never happen for many years. But at least as far as we can go to make it permanent without amending the charter, I think it's a responsibility that we have this year. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. McKernan.
Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, what we'd like to see at the Human Rights Councils is states applying the human rights framework in a principled way to other situations across the world, as I think they have done in the case of Ukraine, which has been very encouraging. But we would like to see other powerful countries who've also escaped attention so far from the Human Rights Council come onto the agenda of the Human Rights Council. I mean, most notably, I would say that in respect of China. And this is a country that Human Rights Watch has worked on a huge amount. We've issued a report documenting what we characterise as crimes against humanity against the Uyghur population in China. And it's not a topic that's been discussed or been on the agenda at the Human Rights Council. So for us, this is a glaring gap. And for the Human Rights Council to maintain its integrity, it needs to be able to address these powerful countries as well, and very, very serious human rights situations in powerful countries.
As Russia, actually, just to go on this, as Russia was excluded, you think China should be?
We do. I think China does fit within that category. There's no appetite, I would say, at the moment at the Human Rights Council amongst states to do that. But I do think that the membership standards need to be applied to other members as well, and states then can weigh up the evidence that's available in terms of the human rights situation within that country. As I said, in the case of China, we have done extensive reporting and found crimes against humanity. So this is a really serious, severe level of human rights violations, and which does not befit a member of the Human Rights Council.
Thank you. Mr. Kirschmeier?
Yes, a lot has been said, but maybe just to say that indeed I think we saw, and that's maybe hopefully encouraging with the Russian example, that actually errors of the past might not be repeated now, because indeed it might become more difficult now for others to escape scrutiny. I think it was clear that the Russian Federation also stated, or there was criticism that actually now there was much more scrutiny than for others who in the past had violated, had engaged in crimes of aggression or other things. But indeed, so I think now with that, so that would be what I'd hope also to see in the Council, is that in the future that would be a precedent, that it would be less easy to just go about other violations by powerful countries in the future, just building on that example. I think then too, just to echo obviously what the ambassador said, that upgrade to the standing or main organ is a very important discussion, and there is also all those ongoing reviews, like the 21 to 26 review of the Council. Inbuilt in the creation of the Council is a certain steps of review that give possibilities to indeed upgrade the Council. Another point that I think is the better coordination, because very often from an outside that system looks very complicated and opaque, and it is complicated to a certain extent, but I think a better coordination with the Geneva, it's all Geneva based, so in the end also a work of international Geneva to see that the treaty body system, the Human Rights Council with all its mechanisms works better in sync actually, and makes more use of those multifaceted approaches. And maybe to close on another point, it's the civil society participation. So I think that is crucial, and Geneva was always hailed for best civil society participation among different UN organs if you go to Vienna or New York. But then with COVID and the ongoing renovations of Palais des Nations, I think one excuse follows the other that is used by some countries to keep civil society participation rather low. And this might sound technical, but I think it's really an important point. So that's also what I would wish from the Council, to make more leeway in this. And as it, I think, was also said, look at the very important topics, and I think the Council has the potential. We saw last year the global recognition of the right to environment without votes against it. So actually on those thematic issues that link to economic, social and cultural rights, to discrimination, to really also make positive steps there, that's also, I think, an area of development for the Council.
Great, thank you very much. I think we're going to leave it there with this part of the discussion, and we will take some questions in the room. Yes, please name, and I bring you the mic. Name and your organization.
Hi, Casimira Jefford from Geneva Solutions. I have a question for Ambassador Villegas. Last week, the President of the Independent Commission of Inquiry updated the Council on their activities, and he said that they'd made contact or reached out to the parties in the war. But what was implied was that Russia so far hasn't responded to those requests. What are your expectations for contact to be made for Russia to respond? And is that common in other commissions of inquiries for the parties to the conflict not to engage with the commission of inquiry? Thank you.
One by one? Or?
Yes, just...
Yes, it's common, unfortunately. We don't want that. We want all mechanisms of the Council to have the full cooperation of the countries concerned. We have different cases. We have cases, success stories, of cases that when the Commission started, they didn't like it, they didn't vote in favor, but they were able to have a confidence building with the Commission that ended up in a good cooperation, and the Commission entering the country and working with the government. And other cases that, like in this case, so far, the country concerned is not cooperating yet, at least. And it's true, they have been contacted, as he explained before the Council. And as President, this year, I have contacted many delegations, many states that are not cooperating with the commissions and independent experts to explain to them the importance of cooperating, because these commissions are not just to name and shame, they are just to help reverse serious human rights situations that the Council decided that are there. It's not a decision of one country, it's a Council's decision to create a rapporteur, to have a resolution. So I hope that we can have a possibility of full cooperation of all parties involved, all countries concerned, because they are independent. They are the only multilateral body out of the ones that are in the field. But also, if the Russian Federation wants to prove that there is another side of the story, the best way is to cooperate with this commission, independent commission, and be able to, for this commission to work in all areas without restriction, talking to everybody.
Thank you. Is there another question? Please, your name.
Aline Dedean from the UN. I was just gonna, I'm sorry, it's not a question. I've been with the Commission on Human Rights, and I would like to say that Commission is a fact-finding, report-writing, excellent resolutions are coming through the Council of Human Rights. However, the Council of Human Rights has no big power. It has to report to the General Assembly. And the major issues, political issues, go from the General Assembly to the Security Council. And we all know the Security Council is blocked, especially in the case of Russia and China, and there is no effective action. And this is why the political impact is very withdrawn inside, but it doesn't reflect into effective action. And this is the problem that cannot be resolved with any kind of meeting.
Comments on this?
Well, maybe just one comment here. I think yes. So by the structural deferrals and so on, it's mostly right there. But nevertheless, I think if you see that the debate in the Security Council on Ukraine was 1 minute and a half, the resolution in the General Assembly deplored the situation, and what the Council put in place, I think it is quite startling how important that is. And then I think indeed, if it went just again back to the Security Council, it would be circular, but with the possibility of the proof, the fact-finding that is established being used by other entities such as the ICC. So I think we get into other use, also the engagement of civil society that allows us to go beyond just the circulating back into the Security Council. So I think even if the structure is surely limiting, and you say very often we hear the Council doesn't have teeth and so on, doesn't have the possibility to directly enforce its output. I think there's many more other avenues that are now open, which I think are encouraging.
Thank you, Mr. Villegas.
Yes, I would like to add to what you said, that universal jurisdiction that was mentioned is very important also because, for example, lately a former general of Syria was sentenced in Germany, Koblenz, I think, and part of the evidence they put before the court, that's why it's so important to collect well the evidence. Part of the evidence was part of the outcome of the Commission of Inquiry on Syria created by the Council. So that work was also used creatively by other instances of justice. So it's, yes, the Security Council blockage is sad for everybody, but we don't have to lower our guard because of the fact we have to be proactive and look, you know, like water in the stones, how to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, it's clear the Security Council has failed to act adequately in the face of atrocities and in Ukraine in the face of the Russian veto, and that is directly an indictment of the Security Council. It's not directly an indictment of the Human Rights Council. I mean, I think part of the issue is that the Human Rights Council or any other intergovernmental body can't do everything, and the idea is, ideally, it all works as part of a functional system, and we know that the system is not always functional. As the ambassador said, there's no veto, so you have seen that the Human Rights Council act at a time when the Security Council hasn't. In fact, I think some of this advancement on evidence preservation and the like in the Human Rights Council is as a result of Security Council blockages. And the last thing I would say is that ultimately the Human Rights Council needs to be measured not about what happens in Geneva, but what happens on the ground, but that measurement of effect. There are short-term measurements of effect, and there are also long-term measurements of effect, and especially when you're talking about the collection and preservation of evidence and potentially collaboration with the judicial accountability processes.
Any other question? No. So I just would like to ask a final question to Ambassador Villegas. Is there any chance that a Russian general or any other responsible person in this war in Ukraine will end up in front of an international tribunal in the next years, and when?
It will depend on the evolution of the circumstances, of the mechanisms that are in place, and there are different mechanisms, and we don't know yet. But definitely the intention of the ones that are trying to investigate the violations is to have accountability by responsible people and be prosecuted. So we don't know. We are seeing today in Ukraine this trial, and the international community has developed, since Nuremberg, has developed different instances of all types before creating the ICC. So it will be up to the international community to decide what to do in the aftermath of this conflict regarding accountability for atrocities.
Thank you very much. So thank you for this very interesting discussion here, and I hope you'll come back in a year or so we can see how the things are going forward. And for the moment, I just invite you to drink a glass of wine or water and to have something to eat. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.